On today's episode of Field Frequency, I'm joined by Steve Burkett of Plug and Play EV and host of the Coast EVs live stream and podcast. We talk about how Plug and Play evolved from a passion project into a voice bridging EV drivers and the industry. Steve unpacks why storytelling, not slogans, will drive adoption, and what's next as fleets electrify, costs drop, and reliability finally catches up. Let's get into it. Welcome to another episode of Field Frequency. Today I'm joined by Steve Burkett, Plug and Play EV. Steve, thank you for coming on. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Yeah, we've been connected for some time, but I've been appreciating more familiar with you, familiar with what you're doing in the EV space, all the things that you're working on, the resources that you're bringing to market, the information, the education that you're providing. I think it's fantastic. You've been deeply involved in EV consumer education, infrastructure and commentary, all of that. But before we get started, I'd like to round out your story, like you to share with the audience, who you are, what drew you to the space, how your focus has refined over time in the EV industry, and so forth. So please share that.
And thank you for hosting me again. It's likewise, the feeling is mutual. Yeah, first few episodes here of Field Frequency have been really valuable, and the guests are really top notch. So I appreciate the opportunity to be the same. So yeah, my Plug and Play EV has started life as a passion project, really back in probably 2018, 2019, as a YouTube channel for consumer education on electric vehicles, just connecting with EV drivers really and trying to answer some of the questions that I had, jumping back 2 or 3 years. Starting out life with interest in the Chevy Bolt EV, which is timely as this was just revealed as a kind of refreshed version yesterday or the day before we're recording, I guess, over in Los Angeles. So kind of dates me back and closes that loop for me. But the Bolt EV was kind of one of the first affordable or mainstream affordable electric vehicles that came into the sector in the US and Canada at that 250 kind of mile range, and the more affordable end of the market than the kind of six figures we were used to with Teslas and some of the upper end electric vehicles. And having that kind of semi-history with the Chevy Volt, the extended range EV, I was really interested in going, all electric and getting into that kind of area of transportation. So that stoked my interest. And obviously it's a very early days, if we take ourselves back almost 10 years now, it feels like a long time ago, and the infrastructure looked very different, as we'll get onto. But I found myself hitting, a lot of the problems that we take for granted nowadays, cold weather charging, why the battery gave you a lot less range in winter, a lot more range in summer, all of the kind of things that became interesting for EV drivers. I wanted to wrap up into shortish 10, 15-minute videos and try and give people answers to the EV questions that they had. So that was really where the channel started. And my day job as a marketer in the B2B sector was still ongoing on the side, a lot of logistics, telecoms kind of infrastructure work. So it eventually kind of overlapped in 2023, and Plug and Play EV became both a consumer education tool in various kind of forms of content tracks and B2B for marketing services, communications, a wide range of the things that I've been doing in my marketing day-to-day life, but hadn't really applied to an EV sector, which wasn't really there until the last few years, as we'll probably get onto.
So that's good overview. Sitting at that intersection of consumer interest and, of course, the B2B component, that's with the EVSE, EV charging infrastructure sector. You are obviously focused on balancing perspectives because you're creating content that resonates with drivers, just like you talked about right now. You're talking about the refresh of the Bolt. You're tracking what's going on in the the EV sector as it relates to the automobiles coming to market. So you're creating content that would appeal to them. You're looking at the refreshes of different vehicles that come to market. But you're also analyzing EVSE business trends. You're looking at the infrastructure side. I've seen you write extensively about NEVI funding, which we'll probably talk about here in a little bit, maybe as it comes into play. But when you're kind of in that content, that focus, that area of focus, what's the biggest tension that you see between what drivers need, what they want, and what the industry is bringing to market? Where's the consumer voice either understood or perhaps misunderstood most?
Well, if you'd asked me the question probably even 18 months ago, I think the obvious answer would have been reliability. The kind of gap between what charge point operators and folks who are operating charging networks were saying they would give EV drivers and what the reality of what EV drivers are experiencing. I think that's probably fair to say that we are heading in the right direction there. Nobody was going to say it's solved overnight, but we're certainly starting to see much more smooth user interfaces, much more first-time charge success, all of the kind of things that people had moaned about a few years ago. I think we're over that hump as far as I can tell as a EV driver still doing these journeys that I do. And from the voices that we hear from, the audience and the folks that are reading the content, moving into the future, I think it's really starting to get those coverage gaps. And also probably one of the biggest things for me that really isn't talked about a whole lot at the moment, except by the people who are selling it, logically enough, is destination charging and kind of more boring, mundane, lower power charging at the AC level. It's something that everybody knows we need. And, to think about charging at hotels, at apartments, the large percentage of the population that would maybe like to own an electric vehicle but can't because they don't have that advantage of charging in their driveway, and the public charging infrastructure, as good as it's getting, still maybe scares them. It's still a known barrier to people potentially buying an electric vehicle. I think starting to be able to have businesses really understand that its potential to bring EV drivers into their fold, to offer it as a workplace charging benefit. We had Hilton recently, the hotel chain, saying it was their number one booking conversion driver in the list of amenities, well over stuff like, that we like a free newspaper or a complimentary breakfast or pool. All of that kind of stuff is starting to be overtaken by just, a simple ability to charge your EV where you sleep or where you work or where you play, whatever it is. And it really doesn't get that much attention in the industry because, other than, again, those selling it and those trying to put it into places, it's not as exciting as a 600 kilowatt charger at a Mercedes-Benz location that goes in next year. But that being said, it is probably as useful, if not more useful, to a vast population of EV drivers who would potentially buy one, but are still finding it, difficult to charge in the places that they frequent.
Yeah, it's exactly charging where they frequent. I gyms had charging stations. I've only seen one, and it was a boutique. But I always think I'm here at this place for an hour, 5, 6 times a week. Why can't I be charging my car while I'm here? Because I'm here regularly. I could be, netting some electrons while I'm doing what I'm going to be doing anyways. And it's absolutely like you say. It's where that place of interest. There's so much opportunity. It's noteworthy that you'd shout out that Hilton stat that just got released because, I mean, as a driver, obviously I travel more by plane than I do by car when I'm going pretty far distances. But if I'm, Texas, so you can drive 8, 9 hours inside the state and still be inside the state. So when that's going on, I'm looking, for a hotel, and I base that hotel selection around if they have EV charging. And there's always this kind of false presentation around what's really available at the hotel level. They may disclose that EV charging, you get there, and yeah, they have a stub up for a charger that's coming TBD. It's not really there, and
Yep.
or they have chargers that
110 AC outlet, home outlet.
yeah, or they have charging on their radar to install, but there's nothing there, or they have a charger that's broken. Imagine that, a charger that doesn't work. So there's all those bits and pieces, and so you're sitting at a very important point because the work that you're doing, creating, it's about informing, and really even challenging narratives that are out there. And so you're telling stories. Essentially, you're telling the EV story to the market, and so it's important in adoption. But what stories are still not good to hear? Where's that tension at? What is being maybe greenwashed, that you've seen in your experience?
I think the biggest issue we're facing at the moment is obviously storytelling is a crucial piece of this, and that's how, if you go back 10 years, Tesla kind of changed the narrative on electric vehicles by, getting past that sub 100-mile, slow acceleration, and nobody would say that of EVs nowadays. It's all, we know their fast acceleration, we know they can, maybe range is an issue in some cases, but we know they can go 300, 400 miles, and that's because Tesla was able to tell the story without traditional marketing in many ways of getting them to a place and selling a product that changed that narrative. I think we're still in the mainstream at least, the place where we want to go for adoption and that early majority that everybody in the industry is seeking to access now. We're not telling the story of cost particularly well, the cost advantages, and moving on from that kind of green eco narrative, which is important, and it's not something that we should, subsume too much, but we can't expect people to change their ways of driving. A car or a vehicle is an integral part of people's lives, and for a lot of people, it's not an exciting thing. It's a thing that gets them from A to B. It's a functional kind of appliance. And in many ways, EVs fill that gap very well on the cost side, on the experience of driving it side day to day, just around town. It's so much nicer. It's quieter. You can, if assuming we've got, charging at home, you can wake up to 80, 90% and feel comfortable, not have to think about the gas errand every week. There are so many pieces of the ownership narrative that I don't think are really well communicated. The gas kind of story is still well on top, all the advantages of combustion and gasoline for kind of your daily transport. And we're not, as an industry, I don't think, telling the story of, well, here are all the things that, EV is changing your day-to-day life. So when the pushbacks come of, well, I can't go 300 miles, 400 miles without a charge, or this one trip that you take every year will be less sufficient or less good use of time because you have to charge it. Well, there's the other 51 weeks of the year where you don't have to go to a gas station, where you can drive by silently, smoothly. The efficiency of the vehicle is regenerating energy at every stoplight. These are the kind of stories that really don't come up very much. And I think that's the piece of the education gap and the storytelling that we need to advance as an industry beyond the, hey, you're saving the planet spiel, which I think is probably played out now for the mainstream if they ever listen to it at all.
Well, and really, save the planet narrative, it's going to automatically create a political position. And we really need to depoliticize EVs, in my opinion. It doesn't need to be viewed that framework. And for some reason, it gets lumped into, the save the planet narrative. And really, it's not. I think there's some value there. And we could spend a whole time talking a lot about emissions, emissions, and really what it's doing, what it's not doing, the fluff. But, and that gets into that filtering of content. And you talked about the messaging. It's almost like the story is there, but it's not being told well. If we could just get, so like I live in San Antonio, had to make a trip to El Paso. It's, 520 plus miles one way. I can get there. And here's a quick narrative. Here's a quick sound. I can get from San Antonio to El Paso, 500 plus miles with energy costs at $58. That's the cost from one end to the other end. So you're talking about a round trip for just a little over $100. When you pull up to a gas pump, you're in a pickup truck, you dump in 22 gallons. It's not going to be $58, and it's going to be a lot more. And so it's just narratives like that. It's telling a story well. It's telling an honest story because there's convenience factor, there's time factors, there's all kinds of adjustments that go into it. And so, it's telling the right story and telling it well. So as you're creating content, you've brought to market a digest that is go-to resource for industry watch. People like myself that are in a, operating strictly a business to business context, we can still look at your content and it's informative. But as you're compiling it, you've got to filter through a lot of noise, and you've got to determine what is signal, what is distraction. So, what are those filters for you? How do you sort all that noise?
So it's a little schizophrenic as I write because it's, on one side, it's the driver in me trying to argue for what we need on that side, which is primarily the kind of stations and locations and the technologies that matter for EV ownership, right? The things that are moving the needle for somebody who's at home and going to change the experience for the better. So the things we've talked about, home charging, things that are curbside charging programs in big cities where charging is hard to find. A location that bridges a big gap, like we had recently transformative kind of installations in Utah down in Green River, where it was previously 4 schools that were perennially kind of difficult to access, and now there's a supercharger in there. There's a Rivian Adventure Network, the largest in the country, in there. and a bunch of other kind of networks going in. So those kind of places are just, pivotal when they have that kind of action, especially when it's all in one week, which I love. You just break that location open and kind of that's a clear signal to maybe another, four-stall station that opened in my backyard in Massachusetts, which we have ample to kind of serve us right now. On the B2B and the kind of industry side, I think it's more filtering out the announcements. There's plenty of announcements, as you know. You can pick out 50 to 100 every week press releases, but it's the technologies that are actually in the near term, I think, going to move the industry forward and make a difference, a meaningful difference in a realistic kind of pragmatic way. There's plenty of solid state batteries have been forever 5 years away. That may be closer, but it's not something I'm going to report on every week. Hydrogen is a good example of an industry that has just perennially been on the horizon trying to reach for it. And, you don't see the meaningful kind of development of that sector in many ways, but trying to figure out which of the headlines that actually mean something that are maybe going to be here in 6 months time or 12 months time versus those that are just kind of pie in the sky and we may not see it for another 4 or 5 years.
I see where you would want to balance that too. Not even a reporting sense. I'm always balancing those narratives myself as an EV driver, as a consumer, and where my focus is, because I've had experiences and own frustrations. And then, of course, I'm also looking at it from the standpoint of I've got to bring messaging, trying to position yourself as a thought leader in this industry, trying to position yourself as a subject matter expert in this industry and really talk about what's real, what's vaporware, what's, good intentions, pie in the sky, sorting through all of that noise. That's a lot. And so, talking more about your content, the Coast to Coast EV live stream, that's something that has a healthy audience in that you are breaking down the ownership. You're talking about charger issues that really resonate with the EV driver. What in those conversations, in that environment, all these talk points that's happening in the EV Coast to Coast live stream. But what do you see resonating? What are consumers talking about right now? What's happening in that platform?
We vacillate between the two aspects of either what's going on in the actual model and EV and automaker world, which was obviously a couple of weeks ago the end of the federal incentives for electric vehicle purchases. So that's been the kind of topic that nobody can avoid for the last few months. And then over on the infrastructure side, much more where different charging projects are happening. So the last one we had was this past Wednesday, was really focusing because of the guest, which was shout out to Jay Williams from Wisconsin, really good channel on YouTube that's kind of educating in the Great Lakes region, kind of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, that kind of space, looking at like Quick Trip, which has started to really roll out a very valuable DC fast charging project up in the Wisconsin area and presumably going beyond into Minnesota and Iowa pretty soon. And that kind of regional focus is quite often the name kind of got itself because my co-hosts are one's on the West Coast up in Northern California, the other one's down in the Southeast, and many of our guests end up being kind of desert Southwest, not far from where you are, or up in the Great Lakes, the kind of Rockies. So we end up being a coast-to-coast EVs show that tries to focus on not just US, but Canada as well. And the drivers are very interested in what's happening in their area. So it's hard to kind of talk about one area. And we talked about a DC fast charging boom kind of up in Wisconsin, which just opened its 10th NEVI station, where there's the Quick Trip project kind of opened up a station way up on Lake Superior that is actually even popular for Tesla drivers, because Tesla superchargers up there they're either slower or they're few and far between. So you see those kind of projects that are public-private filling in some gaps. The NACS handle coming on and starting to be at these third-party stations is kind of a big topic, obviously, for that reason. And it really just, people are obsessed with where can I drive my EV next, especially if you're not on the coasts or in Texas or these kind of high-profile EV markets. You have your eye on one particular location or one particular stretch of interstate that you really want to see a charging station pop up, and that's where the infrastructure side is resonating with EV drivers, I think.
You shouted out Quick Trip just now, and I even recall a post that you had on LinkedIn recently where you were kind of contrasting Buc-ee's, which is a Texas, giant retailer, petroleum retailer, and then you kind of contrasted that with Quick Trip. And when I see messages and I see initiatives around what petroleum retailers are doing, it's almost like a fulfillment of something that I saw. So when I first entered the industry, I entered the industry through the oil and gas sector, downstream, literally at the petroleum retail side. So that's where I entered the EV spaces. I was working with dealers. So who would have thought 10 years ago, Midwest-based retailer like Quick Trip would have an EV charging portfolio, and Buc-ee's, Texas-based? Who would have thought that 10 years ago? And I can be honest with you, Steve. I won't name names, but 2016, 2017, 2018, when I was trying to talk to these retailers, whether they were smaller, single side owner operator, or these larger entities like some of the names we just mentioned, they wouldn't take the call. We're an oil business. We'll never have EV chargers. Oh, you'll never have EV chargers? Really? You'll never have them? And yet, so it's really cool to see the fulfillment of these types of things. I mean, Navy funding has been a petroleum retailer, any other entity, and so I think all of those things are really good call outs. And so I liked the post and that you shared. I encourage the audience to go listen to, rather read the post that you shared about the contrast between those two, because I think there's a message in there. Petroleum fueling destination only makes sense that they would also have electrons along with diesel and gasoline. But anyway, so this has been good. We should double click into maybe some of the technology side for this conversation and drill down into some of the technology pieces of all this. So from consumer side, what is it? I-15 118 plug and charge protocol coming to what is it? 2.0.1 OCPP plug and charge. Let's just simplify things here. Plug and charge is clearly modus operandi for the Tesla network. That's we've seen successful. It's easy, but when we look outside of the Tesla network and we look at the other chargers that are in the market, the other the other vehicles that are operating within those networks, plug and charge isn't always seamless. And so, what are you hearing from drivers when it comes to reliability or factors like charge? And what should networks or manufacturers chargers be doing differently? What's going on there?
It's a topic that separates the audience like the Red Sea, really. There are people who are in my inbox every week asking for more episodes on plug and charge. We've had various players on from the industry talking about, what the status of it is right now and where we're going in future. I think it's become one of those topics that it dates back a long way. Like my first real kind of awareness of it was Electrify America being kind of interoperable, with plug and charge way back in 2020, 21. I forget the announcement now. It's a number of years. And still my Ioniq 5 won't plug and charge. Chevy Bolt won't plug and charge. That's really, that experience for me has kind of come in via more simple kind of applications like EVgo's Auto Charge Plus, where those will now can plug into the Pilot Flying J locations, the EVgo locations, and it will just start up. So I have that functionality to an extent. I think for drivers, it's either if they were promised that it was coming and they haven't seen enough development from across the various networks, like some networks they have it, some networks they don't. So that has been a frustration point, or they just don't care. There's another side of the audience that really just thinks we've already got a universal access key. It's called my credit card or my near field communication, Apple Pay, Google Pay. I can tap a transaction terminal and move on from the activation process from there. They don't really see the extra need to have the plug and charge capability. But obviously with Tesla kind of leading the pack and having so many superchargers and the Tesla ownership being, usually around 50% of the market, they're promoting that experience all day. With Tesla being the kind of gold standard for a lot of people in the industry, that has been something that we're chasing. So I think it's just, there's so many players in, to cut a long story short, that it's hard to get to. Even Tesla will have this as they open up the supercharger network. The reason it's been such a seamless experience is that they have 4 models, 5 now, that they have to service. It's all vertically integrated. That's why the supercharger system as a whole, regardless of plug and charge kind of functionality works so seamlessly because they have control over all those pieces. When you get into the third-party charging, it's everybody trying to interact with everybody else, right? So I think we're getting there, but there's so many baby steps that it's not something that I think is, for every EV driver, a priority. I think the biggest thing is just taking a step back and saying, what's the driver experience, right? They want to start a charge is the basic premise. So plug-in charge is great for some people, and if it makes it easier in the long term, fantastic. But for the here and now, for stuff like Nevi and for the requirements of that, there needs to be a payment reader. There needs to be a way you can just tap your card, because that's what everybody has, and get to the races and start it up. So that's what I think, as a driver side, you really want to focus on. How quickly can they start this up in multiple different ways? If it's plug-in charge, fantastic. But if it's just tapping a card, even better, because everybody has that in there wallet already.
Yeah. Well, to take a contrarian position to that, while I agree, it makes sense. The one of the kind of pain points of from a successful charge session, one of the friction points obviously is the credit card reader, and that's it's been a pain point that manufacturers have had to navigate through. There's probably 3-4 manufacturers of credit card readers that are kind of playing in the EV charging space. I mean, there's definitely more than that, but those that are that visible and known. And so manufacturers are partnering with 2 or 3 of them to find the best solution, and then that just becomes another friction point in the transaction piece. And so credit card readers not working, credit card readers timing out. You also have rails associated with it, and if those get disconnected, then you don't have successful charging sessions. While there is that pervasiveness of like, to your point, there's card in pockets and card reader on the machine. We don't need plug and charge. That would cut a piece of hardware out of the equation and maybe lead us towards, I don't know, but we need that redundancy. We need that backup, because what if plug and charge doesn't work? What if there's a software release on the vehicle side and the driver is not updated, or there was a problem with that update? Who knows? There's so many factors, and it's just, it's like, do we go left? Do we go right? Hold. It's a lot to that.
And I think one of the biggest things is just how long it's taken so far to get, if you told me that plug and charge could be delivered seamlessly across the 90% of vehicles by next year, I'd say go for, and it's an experience that I much prefer. If I can go with that, then I will. But knowing the things that, hurdles that are in the way for the foreseeable future, and as we talked about, getting to that early majority, the mainstream, just asking yourself what they're familiar with, what's going to be the path of least resistance for them. Certainly plugging in and charging is the easiest way, but failing that, what are they familiar with? Gas pump, credit card reader, just, swiping and off they go. So, I mean, if they can do it in the gas station world, I don't think that we can't do it. And maybe just, from my personal perspective, whoever Rivian is using for their payment terminal, use that, because that works perfectly and wonderfully every time. So maybe people need to be talking to the Rivian UI team about how to develop that, roll it out more smoothly.
Well, I'm embarrassed to admit this. Having worked for Rivian, I've never been to a Rivian charging destination. Of course, I don't own a Rivian, but I would just, it controls, and the stars have never aligned for me to go to a Rivian Adventure Network site. The pictures I've seen are nice.
It's not a huge network at the moment, and I don't know exactly. They've got about 85% of them, I think, at this point upgraded, so that's great, but it's also only 120, 130 locations at last count. Whether or not one is near you or is really down to kind of...
When I was at Rivian, I was on the infrastructure team at Rivian, but I wasn't a part of the Rivian Adventure Network. I was on the Rivian Waypoint networks when Rivian had that division. It was really about building out, and had some pretty actually ambitious goals around deployments in the level 2 side. Some brand Rivian level 2 chargers distributed across this. And at one point there was like a goal of 10,000 units or something like that. But there was a pivot to focus on the Adventure Network. I think probably that's the right business decision. Either way, I need to get by Rivian site, and I definitely am interested to see what that payment terminal and payment processor looks like, because to see that, because I might have to make a suggestion.
Credit, but it's definitely a little bit pricey, so I don't know. It depends whether you're in a Rivian or not and what time of use you use it, but it can get a bit expensive. But it's a nice experience for sure.
Yeah. Well, we were talking, going back to the plug-in charge, the credit card, staying in that vein of thought, and where that friction points. Fleets, obviously, they're looking to streamline that transaction process, whether it's through near field communication, RFID cards that they swipe and go, but kind of the looking at things through the lens of the fleet and electrification. I've seen some newsletters editions that you've had that's touched on fleet electrification. And so I know we've kind of been talking about the consumer aspect of it, but kind of shifting over to the business side of it, the fleet electrification side of it. Where do you see maybe opportunities or frictions, pain in scaling fleet charging? What's that look like, and what have you seen?
I think the fleet side is where adoption can really spike. It's always appealed to me because it's one of those areas where you, as we said, you strip away so many of most of the politics comes out of it. Most of it's really an economic decision for fleets because it's not one vehicle or two vehicles that we have in our private driveway. It's often small fleets, even from 10, 20 vehicles all the way up to several hundred. And it's purely unit economics. What does it cost me to run this combustion vehicle over the course of a year? Running costs, fueling costs, maintenance, and what would an EV look like? And they can run those costs, and it's the beauty of that is once the numbers pencil out, even with, a slightly more expensive vehicle upfront, they see how much they can save in maintenance and fueling costs over a 5-10 year ownership period. And it pencils out immediately because they do this every year. This is their budgeting process. They're purely bottom line driven. I think probably the smaller fleets, the, light duty, medium duty vehicles that are on local routes, especially around cities and metro areas, is the real area that there's a lot of opportunity still. Some fleets are really starting to move that. But the beauty of it that I find from, folks I speak to who, do this for a living is that they can start off with a pilot. There's a foot in the door kind of thing of, these vehicles go different distances, have different routes. They can start off with the easiest one, the one that's going maybe, 50 to 100 miles a day. They can make a charging solution for that one vehicle, and it acts as a really nice foot in the door and a conversation starter to that unit economics conversation. They can see from one vehicle and a pilot program for a year or two how that plays out for that one vehicle, and then extrapolate those numbers across 5, 10, 50, 100 vehicles in the fleet. So that seems to be where a lot of the focus is right now for the fleet management companies, trying to kind of help folks understand that, it's not just that upfront cost, it's the savings over that period and how to start off, just get the ball rolling. In terms of challenges, it's it all emanates out of California. I think there's the heavy duty side of it really starting to build. There are some beautiful locations, charging hubs coming up in the kind of Port of Los Angeles, Long Beach area that will be fairly regularly covered in my newsletter, but that's because that's where it's happening, right? There's not a whole lot happening here on the East Coast. There's a few notable exceptions, but the difficulty I think there is you do start to run into politics because on the West Coast especially, you're starting to get some of these mandates and some of these requirements to have a certain fleet percentage become zero emissions or low emissions, whatever the kind of mandates are in the area. And that starts to run up against industry lobbyists, and that's where the voices against having to be forced into that decision and forced down the path of making a big expenditure on something right now that may or may not be part of your business plan in the years to come is really, it's starting to grind against the actual progress, which would come if we just embraced again that same narrative of, test it out. Start with your fleet, start with one vehicle, start with a few vehicles and see how that pencils out. And that becomes much more of a carrot, approach than the stick of policy, trying to beat them down and make them invest now for something they really don't, haven't been convinced is the argument. So it really comes back to that same kind of narrative storytelling piece of how do you just get a foot in the door and make that, the case point for you've got your own story now. You can see the savings that these electric fleet vehicles are delivering you. Now all you need to do is make a plan to make it a reality for the rest of the fleet.
Well, and there's also some historical data points outside of in a fleet electrification context outside of EV. You can look to CNG, you can look to LNG, you can look to some of those other fuels that fleets began to look at. I know personally, I have a fleet. I used to be a fleet manager, was involved in transportation and in a fleet environment for 14 years. And I want to say CNG as a conversion. You can see CNG conversions and CNG acquisitions. So it was in existing fleet vehicles and from diesel to CNG, and then also buying new CNG powered vehicles. And we saw, this ties in that total cost of ownership messaging that fleets need to look at to get away from the depoliticize the message. Don't make this a partisan thing. Let's just look at numbers. So the EV sector, looking at the fleet, the EV sector could cite CNG. I just know firsthand. I experienced it firsthand. Preventative maintenance costs on CNG powered vehicles dropped compared to the diesel powered. The reason why the preventative maintenance costs dropped because the fuel was burning cleaner, so filters stayed cleaner longer, oil stayed cleaner longer. There were so many byproducts of that transition from diesel to CNG. Well, then that's still a fuel. That's still a kind of a liquid fuel source, you might say. It's compressed natural gas, but at the same time, when you look at electrons, you've reduced your parts costs because there's not as many moving pieces to break. And then while there's still oil in a CNG vehicle, there's no oil in an EV. And so it's like there's so many, just looking at it through the lens of total cost of ownership and not just, hey, we're going to convert the whole fleet. Let's identify a segment of the fleet, focus on that and see how it does. Well, you're going to see that it does well, and your total cost of ownership is going to decrease. But you look at things not only through the lens of US and Canada, you kind of zoomed out and you look at things at a broader level. And so I've seen you highlight international EV news or lessons that the US needs to take into account, or some maybe knowledge or experience that we should be leveraging, the US should be leveraging to accelerate adoption and infrastructure like is happening in parts of the globe.
Yeah, so the newsletter, the weekly one-to-one, kind of focuses on North America, so that's US and Canada. For my perspective, at least, just where I'm based, the accent may betray it. I'm from the UK originally, so I have trips back to England specifically, but get across to the continent and see the Western European kind of progress that they've made. The one that we're really on the path already is standardization. Obviously, when we talk about connector types, and nobody, one big barrier has been in the past talking about CHAdeMO, CCS1, NACS as it was, so far, but will eventually be J3400 and the Tesla connector beforehand. Having to get over all those barriers and talk to people about, which plug they need and which connector type they need has not been helpful. So, on our path and getting towards a point where we, like the Europeans aligning around CCS2, us being able to align on NACS J3400 long term, I think is going to be beneficial. And then really going back to the kind of the things that we've been talking about, right? Like how you can access across networks very easily, having those open payment systems, interoperability, kind of a lot of, nerdy stuff that gets into the weeds on our side of the industry, but also, for the driver, it doesn't have to be that hard, right? There's a lot of things that we can do here to make it much easier to just pull up to a pump, for want of a better word, dispenser, really, electron dispenser, and get it to start easily, as we've discussed already, payment very simply, and just get that off to the races without having a whole load of difficulty to, it's more stuff that you don't want to put in front of the consumer at the end of the day. You just want it to be a seamless experience. Again, going back to the Tesla example, closed ecosystem, but they know you can buy a Tesla, plug in a destination, and it will get you there. If you need to go a certain route, it'll figure it out. You will be able to plug in at the time and not have to think about it. That's where we need to go as an industry, and that's what Europe, which has been, if you think about the complexity of Europe as a market, we've got the States over here, certainly, and there are different, dynamics to each individual region and state, but over there it's different countries and it's different, currencies in some cases. So they really are dealing with a lot more, diversity and moving factors, and they've managed to figure out the standardization of payment systems, the roaming agreements, the interoperability, and the connector type. So if they can do it, then we can certainly do it once we start to get a little bit of, momentum in the same direction with all of the players who are there to make it happen.
While you were talking from that kind of global perspective, I was looking for a data point. So I was at Move a couple weeks ago. My friends over at Volterra, shout out to my friend Jonathan Colbert, who's going to be on Field Frequency hopefully pretty soon. But they were giving a presentation. They were kind of looking at the global shift in EV adoption, and so they've stat that I think is kind of germane to this conversation what we're having right now, and this ad was looking at global market share in terms of EV as it compares to 2024. And this was a notable stat that stood out to me. I went and looked for it while you were talking. In 2014, the US had 12% global, kind of global share when it comes to infrastructure, specifically DC fast charging infrastructure. Publicly, DC fast charging from a global standpoint, the U.S. was sitting at 12%. While China was sitting at 44%. That was in 2014. Then they had this cool little graph that shifted forward to 2024. China went up to 80% in terms of global share with publicly accessible DC fast chargers, dropping the US from 12% to 2%. So we got eclipsed, and then there was, in Europe, it was the same thing. I mean, while they kind of held their own, they were at a 11% global share in 2014, then dropped to 9% by 2024, just because of the amount of growth in China. Which it's, of course, different messaging there. It's kind of like we're going to tell you what to buy, and that's what you're going to buy, and we'll put the chargers in. A little different. But I think still notable.
Sure. But I think there is a narrative here, in that kind of comes back to the type of vehicles that are available, right? And the big elephant in the room is at some point Chinese EVs will make their way over here by one way or another, whether it's trade deals or, it just, I think it was, again, to go back to the other folks' experience, I think it's Synergy EV down in Mexico. Paco down there was kind of doing a trip and looking at the chargers, and it's full of BYD seals and BYD dolphins. And I think I haven't been able to check the stat yet, but it was more than half of the vehicles that were, making up Mexican EV adoption were Chinese models. And if you think about how close that is, it often feels like the Chinese kind of models are a long way away. We see it in Europe, and you see those kind of global lessons coming through from those markets, but it feels like we might be able to hold that at bay for the US and Canada. It's there at some point. It's right on the doorstep, and once there's either a more friendly administration that wants to allow that competition in, or a trade deal that comes around and makes it, so that the vehicles are produced here and creating jobs in America, and that's a more, sweet pill to swallow for any US administration. That's where it starts to become, the price competition just goes into overdrive at that point, because they make them very cheaply. They're high quality cars, lots of technology, and that's where we start to get into, do we want to have that narrative of the US as a innovator and a tech leader? Because we talk about Tesla, they're the ones that kicked this door open for the most part for most of us. With my Bolt EV was kind of probably predicated by a Model 3 knocking on GM's door. A lot of the models that we have in the US right now are based on competing with Tesla, but that may become flipped on its head. The US as a innovator and leader, as your stats kind of point out there, is at risk here, and we need to kind of at least have a plan to make ourselves kind of hold our own, as well as allowing in the competition that kind of drives electrification long term.
Agreed. We're gonna have to find a way. We're gonna have to find a way, and it will be interesting to see if there is another approach for alternative products, BYD, to be available to the U.S. consumer. It could help just to create a way to get there. Policy shifts going on. There's so much stuff going on, and there's a lot of headwinds. If you were to kind of pull out the crystal ball, what does that look like? Where are we going in the next 3 to 5 years?
I think it comes down to those two topics we've touched on already, affordability and education. We're in the midst of an affordability reset, really. The whole industry has to figure out, including the ones that are, leading, like Tesla, has to figure out how to get to a place where they can make cars profitably, but also get them into a place that is accessible to the everyday person who doesn't really care what they drive that much. They care about cost, and the pencils out over the 5, 10, 15 years ownership that they intend to keep that vehicle. And then it's education. It's just dispelling a lot of these rumors and myths that kind of are still out there. I have so many conversations with folks who are thought about going electric but have just they said, well, it's not any cleaner because it runs on coal. I don't know the last time you had, coal-powered household, but in Massachusetts, that isn't the case. Natural gas maybe, but you've got to look at your energy mix for this year, not 2010. The kind of rumors of, that people still think they're driving a Nissan Leaf, maybe in every EV, from 2020, can't go more than 100 miles, that you have to stop to recharge for an hour or two every 100-mile stint. All these things are, in one sense, a success for the folks folks who are pushing against electrification. Certainly, they've told that story and it's continuing to stick. But it's also a failure of our side of the sector to really not just showcase the benefits of EVs, but say, look, this is happening day to day. People are driving coast to coast. People are now driving coast to coast with full self driving and autonomous driving and things that are unique in many cases to electric vehicles. So we need to flip that on its head and have that education piece not just be a busting those myths and getting people up to speed with what we can do now, but painting a picture of where transportation goes in future. And Tesla does that well to a certain extent, but I think it needs the wider industry to say, this is what this vehicle is going to do for you in future. It's incredible now. What it will do for you in 5 or 10 years is something that gasoline or combustion vehicles will never do for you. And you start to paint that futurist and visionary picture, and I think it becomes a much more compelling tale for embracing electric vehicles and moving that story forward.
Right. A good story told well. That's how we get there. Well, Steve, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate you sharing your background, your insights. Thank you for what you're doing in the space. Thank you for the resources you're bringing to market, keeping us all informed. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate you being on Field Frequency. It's been a great conversation. Any closing comments? Anything you want to share with the audience?
Really, just the weekly newsletter is probably one of the best pieces to catch me on a regular basis. The videos flow here and there as we can do them, but that's at evi.plugendplayev.com. It's free newsletters every week. Stations in your area if you're an EV driver, or the latest news and kind of analysis if you're in the industry. Hopefully there's something for everyone.
Someone wanted to connect with you directly, they can reach you on LinkedIn. Any other resources or to connect with you at?
LinkedIn's probably the best place. DM on there or just a comment, and I'll get back to you. I'm pretty open to connecting, so happy to hear thoughts, questions, any of that stuff. I'll field on LinkedIn for sure.
Steve, thank you for being on Field Frequency.
Thanks so much, and keep up the great work. Really enjoying the episode.